The world knows him as Dracula, a creature of the night who drinks the blood of the living. This is a comforting lie. The real man who inspired the legend was not a vampire. He was a warlord, a prince, and a monster whose methods of cruelty were so extreme they would make a vampire look merciful. He did not haunt the shadows. He commanded armies in the harsh light of day. He did not fear the cross. He waged a holy war under its banner. And his greatest act of terror was not a bite on the neck, but a meticulously constructed forest of over 20,000 impaled corpses, designed to break the will of an invading empire. The man responsible for this horror was not a creature of folklore. He was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, a celebrated crusader, a brilliant military commander, and a man so consumed by the trauma of his youth that he sought to purge the world of chaos with a fire of his own making. This, then, is the central puzzle. How does a man who fought to defend Christendom become its most terrifying monster? How is a life of such profound violence and righteous fury transformed into a simple ghost story? This is the story of how a nation's brutal hero became the world's most famous villain. It is the tragedy of a man who fought monsters for so long that he became one himself, leaving a stain on history so dark it could only be explained as the work of the undead. If you believe these complex stories from our past are important and must be remembered, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Your support allows us to continue these journeys into the archives. Our story begins in a land bathed in blood. To understand the man who would become Dracula, we must first understand the world that created him. This is not the fairy tale Transylvania of misty mountains and crumbling castles. This is 15th century Wallachia, a jagged shard of a kingdom caught in the gears of a world-ending war. It is a Christian principality, a bloody and defiant spear tip pressed against the throat of the world's rising superpower, the Ottoman Empire. The very soil here is dark, with the memory of 1,000 battles. The forests are haunted by the ghosts of forgotten armies, and the air itself seems to carry a permanent, metallic scent of fear. For a century, the sultans of the East have been marching west, their armies a seemingly unstoppable tide, swallowing the old Byzantine Empire and pushing ever deeper into the heart of Europe. The great city of Constantinople, once the invincible heart of Eastern Christendom, is now a shadow of its former self, a dying jewel waiting for the final, fatal blow. To the north and west of Wallachia lies the great kingdom of Hungary, a bastion of Christendom, which sees Wallachia not as a sovereign ally, but as a crucial and ultimately disposable buffer state, a military shield designed to absorb the first, most violent shocks of the Ottoman war machine. Wallachia is a land of wolves, both literal and human. Its throne is not a seat of comfort and power. It is a death sentence. To be the prince, the voivode of Wallachia, is to be a man standing on a knife's edge, balancing on a wire strung between two ravenous lions. Every day is a desperate calculation for survival. Do you anger the powerful Hungarian king by paying tribute to the Sultan? Or do you invite the Sultan's annihilating wrath by allying with the Hungarians? It is a world of impossible choices, where loyalty is a commodity and betrayal is the common language of politics. The princes of this land do not die of old age in their beds. They are assassinated by their rivals, executed by their enemies, or murdered by their own ambitious nobles in the cold darkness of their own bedchambers. This is the world that forges men like steel, hard, sharp, and brittle. It is a world that has no room for mercy, a world that rewards only strength, cunning, and a capacity for absolute brutality. It is the perfect crucible in which to create a monster. In the year 1431, into this cauldron of violence, a son was born to the ruler of Wallachia. His father was a man named Vlad II, and to secure his fragile throne, he had just made a sacred and terrible vow. He had traveled to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, to the magnificent imperial city of Nuremberg. There, in a ceremony of great pomp and solemnity, he was inducted by the Emperor Sigismund himself into a secret society, a chivalric order of Christian knights. The order was founded for a single desperate purpose: to defend the cross against the crescent, to hold the line against the Ottoman tide. Its members were the great princes and kings of Eastern Europe, men who lived on the front lines of this holy war, bound by a sacred oath to shield Christendom from the armies of Islam. Their symbol was a dragon, its wings unfurled and its tail coiled around its own neck, a symbol of the evil they swore to defeat, and perhaps a symbol of the beastly nature they themselves would have to embrace to win. And so, Vlad II was given a new title, a mark of his holy duty. He was now Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Dragon. He wore its insignia with pride, a golden dragon pendant hanging from his neck, a public declaration of his allegiance. He even had the image of the dragon minted onto his coins and painted onto the walls of his churches. He was, in the eyes of the West, a holy warrior. But in the suspicious and superstitious lands of Wallachia, the word Dracul held a dark double meaning. In modern Romanian, it translates directly to the devil. While in the 15th century the association was less direct, the connotation was still there. The dragon was the serpent of the apocalypse, the great beast of Revelation. To the peasants who toiled in the fields and whispered stories by the firelight, their prince had not just allied himself with a Christian order, he had taken on the aspect of a dark and powerful creature. To some, he was a holy crusader. To others, he was a man who had made a pact with a darker power. It was a title his second son would inherit, with a slight but significant change. In the language of the region, adding an A to the end of a name meant son of. The boy born that year in the cold and forbidding fortress of Sighișoara was not yet an impaler, not yet a creature of the night. He was simply Vlad III, son of the dragon, Dracula. For the first 12 years of his life, young Vlad Dracula lived the brutal education of a Wallachian prince. His nursery was an armory. His lullabies were the songs of soldiers marching to war. He learned to ride a horse before he could properly read, his small hands learning the feel of the reins before the shape of the alphabet. He learned the art of the sword from grizzled veterans whose faces were maps of old battles. He learned the strategy of the battlefield, the grim calculus of how many men must be sacrificed to hold a mountain pass for a single day. Most importantly, he learned the cold arithmetic of courtly intrigue from his father. He watched Vlad the Dragon navigate a world of constant threat. He saw the grim-faced envoys from the Hungarian king, their chests puffed with arrogance, demanding soldiers for their crusades. He saw the silent, watchful messengers from the Ottoman Sultan, their eyes missing nothing, their polite words dripping with veiled threats. He learned that his homeland was not a kingdom, but a pawn in a game played by giants. His father was a master of this game. For years, Vlad Dracul performed a dangerous diplomatic dance. When the Hungarians were strong, he would refuse to pay tribute to the Sultan and declare his allegiance to the cross. But when the Hungarian armies retreated and the shadow of the Ottoman crescent fell across the Danube, he would quietly send gold to the Sultan's court, a necessary bribe to keep the peace and save his people from annihilation. He was not a hero, he was a pragmatist, a survivor. He taught his son that promises are written in sand, and survival is written in blood. But in 1442, the dance ended. The Sultan, Murad II, a shrewd and ruthless leader, grew tired of the dragon's shifting loyalties. He had received word that Vlad Dracula was once again plotting with the Hungarians for a new crusade. The Sultan decided to put a permanent leash on his troublesome vassal. He demanded a meeting, summoning Vlad Dracula and his two young sons, the 13-year-old Vlad and his beautiful younger brother, Radu, to his court at Edirne in the Gallipoli Peninsula. The summons was presented not as a threat, but as a diplomatic courtesy, a chance to prove his loyalty. It was a trap. Upon their arrival, the Wallachian prince was confronted, accused of treachery, and thrown into a dungeon. His sons were now orphans of a living father, alone and powerless in the heart of their enemy's empire. After a period of imprisonment designed to break his spirit, the Sultan offered Vlad Dracula a terrible bargain. He could have his throne back. He could return to Wallachia and rule as its prince. But he had to leave a promise behind. A living, breathing guarantee of his future loyalty. He had to leave his sons. Imagine the choice. Abandon your children to your greatest enemy, knowing they will be raised in a foreign culture and a hostile faith. Their lives forfeit at your first sign of rebellion. Or refuse and be executed on the spot, leaving your children as orphans to be raised as slaves or assassins by the very man who killed you. For Vlad Dracula, a man of power, there was no real choice. A ruler's duty is to his throne, not to his blood. He agreed to the Sultan's terms. He was brought before his children one last time. We can only imagine the scene. The father, his face a mask of grim necessity, unable to meet his children's eyes. The younger Radu, perhaps weeping in confusion. And Vlad, 13 years old, on the cusp of manhood, staring at his father with an expression of cold, dawning comprehension. He was learning the first and most important lesson of his life, that even a father's love is secondary to the cold, hard demands of power. He had been betrayed, sacrificed for the sake of a fragile throne. He was no longer just a prince. He was a pawn. He watched his father turn and walk away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stone hall, a sound of final, absolute abandonment. Life in the Ottoman court was a masterclass in psychological torment. On the surface, the boys were not treated as prisoners in a dungeon. They were raised as princes, a calculated act of both generosity and cruelty by the Sultan. They lived in a world of unimaginable luxury, of fine silks from Persia, of sweet spices from the East, of sprawling palaces with courtyards filled with the gentle music of fountains and the scent of jasmine. They were given the finest education, learning science, philosophy, art, and warfare. They studied the Quran. They learned to speak perfect Turkish, and they rode and fought alongside the Sultan's own sons, including the brilliant and ambitious boy who would one day be known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror. But this luxury was a lie. It was a beautiful cage, and the boys knew that the bars were always there. They were under constant surveillance by the silent, watchful eunuchs of the court. Every word they spoke was noted. Every friendship they made was analyzed. They were daily, living reminders of their father's submission. And they knew, with the cold certainty that only a child in constant danger can possess, that if their father were to make a single political misstep, a single move toward his Hungarian allies, a quiet order would be given, and their throats would be cut before the news of their father's treachery ever reached home. This constant, simmering threat of death became the air they breathed. It was a lesson in the true nature of power. Not the loud, performative power of the Wallachian court with its bickering nobles, but the quiet, absolute and inescapable power of the Sultan, a man whose will was as final and as unarguable as death itself. This lesson forged the two brothers in completely different ways. Radu, the younger and more handsome, adapted. He was a pragmatist, perhaps even a hedonist. He saw the overwhelming power and sophistication of the Ottoman world and chose to become a part of it. He embraced their culture, learned their language perfectly, and eventually converted to Islam. He was charming and beautiful, and he soon became a favorite of the young Mehmed, the heir to the Ottoman throne. The chronicles of the time are filled with whispers that they became lovers. Radu chose survival through assimilation. He became a willing and beloved part of the gilded cage, finding a new father and a new identity in the court of his captors. Vlad was different. He did not adapt. He hardened. The betrayal by his father and the humiliation of his captivity did not break his spirit. It filled it with a cold, unbending, and patient rage. He was defiant, proud, and quick to anger, earning him a reputation for being difficult and stubborn. He studied his captors with a cold, analytical fury. He learned their language, their religion, and their military tactics not to join them, but to one day use that knowledge against them. He saw their power not as something to be admired, but as a system to be mastered and, eventually, broken. While Radu was learning the soft arts of the court, Vlad was memorizing the weaknesses in the fortress walls. He was a coiled snake, watching, waiting, his hatred a small, cold fire he kept burning in the deepest part of his soul. Then, in the year 1447, when Vlad was 17 years old, news from Wallachia arrived at the Ottoman court. It was the news that would shatter his world and unleash the monster within. A powerful Hungarian warlord, John Hunyadi, had invaded Wallachia, determined to place a ruler loyal to Hungary on the throne. Vlad's father, the dragon, was overthrown. But he was not just defeated in battle. He was captured by his own treacherous nobles, the boyar families who had chafed under his rule and saw an opportunity to gain favor with the Hungarians. He was brutally murdered, his body left in the marshy swamps near Balteni. Vlad's older brother and heir, Mircea, the one who had been left behind to rule, suffered an even more horrifying fate. The boyars, to make a statement of their new allegiance and to settle old scores, seized him. They blinded him with a red-hot iron poker, and then, while he was still screaming in agony, they buried him alive. Imagine receiving this news. You are a teenage boy, a prisoner thousands of miles from home, and you learn that your father and brother are dead, not at the hands of a foreign enemy, but betrayed and butchered by their own people. The helplessness of that moment is unimaginable. The rage, indescribable. In that instant, Vlad Dracula's worldview was cemented. The world was a nest of vipers. The boyars were a cancerous rot in the heart of his kingdom, a class of traitors who understood only the language of pain. And the Ottomans, who held him captive and did nothing to save his father, were not his protectors. They were simply the architects of his family's destruction. His grief was a fire that burned away the last of his boyhood innocence. What remained was a cold, hard, and absolute purpose. He would survive. He would escape this prison. He would return to Wallachia and reclaim his father's throne. And he would purge his homeland of the traitors who had destroyed his family. He would not just punish them. He would annihilate them. He would grind them and their families into dust. He would build a new kind of kingdom, an orderly kingdom, a kingdom cleansed by fear and washed in the blood of his enemies. The young prince, son of the dragon, had found his holy cause. It was not a war for Christ or for country. It was a war of absolute, personal, and methodical vengeance. In the cold halls of the Ottoman court, the news of his father's and brother's murders was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. The Sultan, Murad II, saw the chessboard of Balkan politics rearranging itself. Wallachia was now under the control of a voivode loyal to Hungary. a man named Vladislav II, put on the throne by the formidable Hungarian warlord John Hunyadi. For the Sultan, this was an unacceptable intrusion, a strengthening of the Christian alliance on his very doorstep. He now needed a countermove, a weapon to destabilize his enemy, and he had one, waiting in the wings, his heart a cold, hard knot of grief and rage. He had Vlad Dracula. For the 17-year-old prince, the moment was a bitter paradox. The men who had held him captive for years, the architects of his family's ruin, now offered him his heart's desire. They would give him an army. They would help him seize the throne that was his by birthright. He was to be their instrument, their puppet king, sent to reclaim Wallachia, not for Wallachia, but for the empire. It was a deal with the devil, but for a boy who had lost everything, it was the only deal on the table. He agreed. In the autumn of 1448, Vlad Dracula rode at the head of a Turkish army, crossing the Danube back into the homeland he barely remembered. This was not the triumphant return of a beloved prince, but the invasion of a foreign-backed claimant. The peasants who watched from the fields would have seen not the son of their old ruler, but a young man in the company of their most hated enemies. His first act as a would-be king was to wage war on his own people. The campaign was swift and brutal. The ruling voivode, Vladislav II, was away fighting the Ottomans in the south, leaving the throne exposed. Vlad's army smashed through the thin defenses, and he seized the capital city of Targovishte. He walked into the throne room of his father, the princely court, and sat upon the seat of power he had dreamed of for years. The victory was breathtaking. He was, at last, the voivode of Wallachia. But it was a hollow victory, a kingdom built on sand. The throne felt cold, the crown too heavy. He was surrounded by the very boyar families who had betrayed his father, their faces now masks of fawning, insincere loyalty. They bowed to him, called him prince, but he could see the calculation in their eyes. They saw him not as their ruler, but as a temporary inconvenience, a boy playing king, propped up by Turkish swords. He had no army of his own, no treasury, no loyal power base. His only authority came from the Ottoman soldiers garrisoned outside the city walls, soldiers who served the Sultan, not him. This was not the glorious return he had envisioned. It was just a different kind of gilded cage. His reign was destined to be short. The moment John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian warlord, learned that an Ottoman puppet was sitting on the Wallachian throne, he turned his own army around. He marched back towards Wallachia, his intent clear, to crush the boy and restore his own chosen ruler. The Sultan, having achieved his goal of temporarily disrupting Hungarian power, simply withdrew his support. Vlad was on his own. After only 2 months, his fragile kingdom collapsed. With the Hungarian army approaching and his own nobles ready to betray him at a moment's notice, Vlad was forced to make a choice. A glorious death in a battle he could not win, or a humiliating flight into exile. He chose to live. He abandoned the throne, slipped out of the capital in the dead of night, and vanished. His first taste of power had been a fleeting, bitter mouthful of poison. What followed were 8 long years of wandering. This was the period that truly forged the Impaler. He was no longer a prince, not even a puppet. He was a political refugee, a landless, powerless noble with a price on his head, a ghost haunting the courts of Eastern Europe. He fled first to the neighboring Principality of Moldavia, where his uncle ruled. For a time, he found a fragile sanctuary, a moment to catch his breath and lick his wounds. But the Game of Thrones in this part of the world was a deadly one. His uncle was assassinated, and Vlad was once again forced to run. He made a decision that speaks to his incredible audacity and his profound understanding of power. He traveled to the one place in the world he should have feared most, the Kingdom of Hungary. He journeyed into the heart of his enemy's territory and presented himself before John Hunyadi, the very man who had deposed him, the man whose political maneuvering had led to his father's death. It was the ultimate humiliation, a proud dragon begging for scraps at the table of the man who had slain his family. He became a political prisoner of a different sort, a guest of the Hungarian court, whose movements were watched, his potential uses constantly calculated. But for Vlad, this was not a period of idle despair. It was his true education. In the Ottoman court, he had learned the nature of absolute power. In the Hungarian court, he learned the art of war from the greatest Christian commander of the age. He studied Hunyadi's tactics, his strategies, his brilliant use of mercenary armies. He watched, he listened, and he learned how to fight the Turks from the man who fought them best. These years of exile were a crucible that burned away the last of his youthful arrogance. He learned that power given by others can always be taken away. He learned that loyalty bought with promises is worthless. He learned that true power, the kind that lasts, does not come from a foreign army or a royal title. It must be seized, and it must be secured through a will so absolute, so unwavering, and so terrifying that no one would ever dare to challenge it. His desire for vengeance, which had been a hot, impulsive rage, now cooled into a patient, methodical, and chilling obsession. He was no longer just dreaming of revenge. He was drafting a blueprint for it. Then, in 1453, the world changed forever. His childhood rival, the boy he had grown up with in the Ottoman court, Sultan Mehmed II, achieved the impossible. He conquered Constantinople, the 1,000-year-old heart of the Byzantine Empire. The news struck Christian Europe with the force of a physical blow. The great enemy was no longer at the gates. He had smashed them down. The fall of the city created a new wave of panic and a new sense of urgency. The Hungarians knew that Wallachia was now more critical than ever, and the man they had propped up on its throne, Vladislav II, was proving to be too soft, too accommodating to the all-powerful Sultan. John Hunyadi, now preparing for an all-out war to defend Belgrade, the gateway to Hungary itself, needed a new kind of prince in Wallachia. He didn't need a diplomat. He needed a rabid dog. He needed a man who hated the Turks with a personal, all-consuming passion. A man who would not bend, who would not break, and who would not hesitate to use any means necessary to hold the line. He needed the man he had been holding in his court for years. He needed the son of the dragon. And so, the wheel of fortune turned one last time. Hunyadi summoned Vlad, now a man of 25, no longer a boy, his face hardened by years of exile, his eyes holding a cold, dangerous fire. He offered him a second chance, an army to reclaim his throne. This time, there was a difference. He would not be an Ottoman puppet. He would be Hungary's sword. In 1456, Vlad Dracula rode towards Wallachia for the second time. He was not the same boy who had fled 8 years earlier. The humiliation of his past had been forged into an unbreakable resolve. The blueprint for his new kingdom was complete. The first names on his list were the boyars who had buried his brother alive. And the first thing he would build would not be a church or a palace. It would be a new kind of justice, a justice built of fear, written on the point of a stake. The Impaler Prince was coming home. In the summer of 1456, Vlad Dracula returned to Wallachia not as a pawn, but as a predator. He met his rival, the Hungarian-backed Vladislav II, in single combat on the field of battle and killed him with his own hands. The throne was his, won this time not with the borrowed swords of an empire, but with his own strength and the backing of a small, loyal army of mercenaries who were loyal only to his coin and his cold, commanding presence. He was, at last, the undisputed voivode. He entered his capital city of Targovishte and established his court. For the great noble families of the realm, the boyars, this was a moment of deep uncertainty. They had betrayed and murdered his father. They had blinded and buried his brother. And now, the last surviving son of the dragon had returned, his mind an unreadable fortress, his years in exile having taught him lessons they could not yet fathom. They watched him, their hearts filled with a quiet, simmering fear. But the new prince did not act. For months, he ruled with a strange and unsettling calm. He attended to the tedious matters of state. He listened to petitions, and he showed no outward sign of the vengeful fire that burned within him. The boyars began to relax. They saw a young man, preoccupied with the burdens of his new office, perhaps too pragmatic to risk a civil war by digging up the bloody ghosts of the past. They mistook his patience for weakness. They believed his silence was forgiveness. It was a fatal miscalculation. As the harsh Wallachian winter began to recede, giving way to the first signs of spring, Vlad announced that he would host a great feast to celebrate the holy day of Easter. He sent invitations to every major boyar family in the land, hundreds of them, declaring that this was to be a moment of unity, a time to forget old grudges and celebrate the rebirth of their kingdom under its rightful prince. The boyars were overjoyed. This was the signal they had been waiting for. The young voivode was extending a hand of friendship. He was ready to forgive and forget. They saw an opportunity to secure their power, to win the favor of the new ruler, and to continue their lives of decadent privilege. On Easter Sunday, they arrived at the princely court in Targovishte in all their splendor. They came in fine carriages, dressed in silks and furs, their wives and daughters adorned with gold and jewels. The great hall was filled with music, laughter, and the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. It was a magnificent spectacle of power and wealth. Vlad greeted them all with a serene and welcoming smile, his face a perfect mask of princely grace. He walked among his guests, sharing a glass of wine here, a polite word there. He looked upon the men who had butchered his family, and he treated them as honored friends. The boyars drank deeply, their relief making the wine taste all the sweeter. They saw their prince, so young and magnanimous, and felt a surge of arrogant confidence. They had gotten away with it. The past was buried. The future was theirs. The feast continued for hours, the music growing louder, the laughter more boisterous, the atmosphere thick with drunken celebration. Then, at the height of the festivities, Vlad rose from his seat at the head of the table. He raised a hand. The music stopped. The laughter died in the throats of the drunken nobles. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the hall. The friendly smile was gone from Vlad's face. In its place was an expression of cold, absolute authority. His eyes, which had seemed so warm and welcoming just moments before, were now like chips of ice. His loyal mercenaries, who had been standing disguised as servants along the walls, moved as one. The great wooden doors of the hall were slammed shut and barred from the outside. The exits were sealed. The feast had ended. The trial was about to begin. Vlad looked out over the sea of confused and suddenly terrified faces. He did not need to raise his voice. His words, spoken in a low, clear, and steady tone, cut through the silence like a blade. "Honored nobles," he began, his voice dripping with a chilling irony. "I look upon you all, the great pillars of this kingdom. You have lived long and prosperous lives. So I ask you a question." He paused. letting his gaze travel from one man to the next. "How many princes have you seen rule this land in your lifetime?" A nervous murmur went through the crowd. One of the oldest boyars, his voice trembling, answered, "Many, my lord. Perhaps 7. 7, Vlad repeated, the word hanging in the air. "And tell me, how did my predecessors meet their end? Did they die peacefully in their beds, surrounded by their loyal subjects?" No one dared to answer. The silence was thick with the memory of their own betrayals. "You do not answer," Vlad continued, his voice growing harder. "Then let me answer for you. You are the reason my father's bones lie in a swamp. You are the reason my brother was blinded and buried like an animal. You are the vipers I found in my own home, the rot that has weakened this kingdom from within, leaving it exposed to its enemies. You feast in my hall, you drink my wine, and you dare to call yourselves noble men. You are a disease, and tonight I am the cure." The trap had been sprung. He had gathered all his enemies in one place. They were unarmed, drunk, and utterly defenseless. The moment of reckoning, the moment he had replayed in his mind for 8 long years of exile, had finally arrived. The judgment was pronounced not with a gavel, but with the cold, hard sound of drawn steel. At Vlad's signal, his soldiers moved through the hall. The scene erupted into chaos. The boyars, so arrogant just moments before, were now screaming, pleading, scrambling over one another in a desperate attempt to escape the inevitable. But there was no escape. They were seized, their fine silks and furs torn, their jewels trampled underfoot. Vlad stood and watched, his face impassive, as his vengeance unfolded. The punishment he had devised was not a simple, clean execution. It was a meticulous and symbolic act, designed to send a message that would echo through Wallachia for a generation. It was to be a punishment in 2 parts. The older boyars, the ones whose hands were stained with the blood of his father and brother, were dragged from the hall into the courtyard outside, along with their wives. There, in the cold light of the spring day, a line of sharpened wooden stakes was waiting for them. The chronicles do not detail the horror of what followed, for it was a common and understood form of execution in that part of the world. But we can imagine the screams, the pleas for a mercy that would not come. By the end of the day, the courtyard of the princely court was a forest of the damned, with the bodies of 500 of the kingdom's most powerful nobles impaled on high. A gruesome warning to any who would ever again contemplate betraying the son of the dragon. But for the younger, healthier nobles and their families, death was a mercy they would not be granted. Their punishment was to be a living one. They were stripped of their fine clothes, chained together in a long, miserable column, and forced to march. They were driven from the capital city on foot, a journey of nearly 80 miles into the rugged, unforgiving wilderness of the Carpathian Mountains. Their destination was a ruin, a crumbling eagle's nest of a fortress perched on a high cliff overlooking the Argesh River. It was an old castle, once belonging to his ancestors, now little more than a pile of rubble. This was to be their tomb, and they were to be its builders. Vlad commanded them to rebuild the fortress, not with fresh stone from a quarry, but with the heavy, broken stones of the ruin itself. These were men and women who had never known a day of physical labor in their lives. Their hands were soft, their bodies unaccustomed to hardship. Now they were slaves. They were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, under the watchful eyes of Vlad's merciless overseers. They hauled heavy stones up the steep cliffside. They mixed mortar with their bare hands. They worked until their fine clothes were tattered rags, until their bodies grew thin and skeletal, until they collapsed and died from exhaustion and starvation. their corpses left where they fell, to be incorporated into the very walls of the structure. This was Poenari Castle. It would become Vlad's true fortress, his personal sanctuary, a symbol of his new order. And it was a symbol built with a terrible poetic justice. He had taken the decadent, corrupt nobility that had destroyed his family, and he had literally ground them into the foundations of his own power. He had built his reign on the bones of the old, rotten order. It was not an act of random, chaotic violence. It was a meticulous and symbolic act of state-building through terror. In one perfectly orchestrated event, he had eliminated his enemies, silenced all dissent, and created a monument to his own terrifying and absolute power. The message was clear. A new kind of prince now ruled Wallachia, a prince who did not forgive, who did not forget, and whose justice was as cold and as hard as the mountain stone was. The forest of impaled boyars outside the princely court was not just an act of vengeance, it was a proclamation. It was the founding document of Vlad Dracula's new Wallachia, a kingdom that would be built not on laws or loyalty, but on a foundation of absolute, unquestioning fear. The message was clear. The old ways were dead, and the price for disorder was a slow, agonizing death. Having surgically removed the perceived cancer of the old nobility, Vlad now turned his cold, analytical gaze upon the body of society itself. He saw a kingdom rife with the sicknesses of corruption, crime, and moral decay, and he resolved to purge it, to burn out the disease until only a state of pure, perfect, and terrifying order remained. His methods were not those of a traditional ruler. They were those of a fanatical ideologue, a social engineer whose only tool was the stake. He declared war not on a foreign enemy, but on human nature itself, on theft, on laziness, on dishonesty, on any deviation from his own rigid and brutal code of conduct. The impaling stake, once reserved for prisoners of war and traitors, now became the ultimate symbol of his domestic policy. It was the swift and public answer to every social ill. The most famous legend of his reign illustrates the chilling effectiveness of his methods. In the central square of his capital, Targovishte, stood a public well where travelers and locals alike would drink. The city, like any other in the 15th century, was a place of petty crime, where a purse left unattended would vanish in an instant. Vlad was determined to change this. One day, he placed a magnificent golden cup, exquisitely crafted and studded with jewels, on the edge of the well. It was left there for all to use, an object of immense value, completely unguarded. He issued a simple, unspoken decree that all of Wallachia understood. Anyone could drink from the cup, but if it were to go missing, the entire neighborhood would pay the price. That golden cup remained in the town square for the entirety of Vlad's reign. It was never touched. Tens of thousands of people, merchants, peasants, travelers, thieves, walked past it every day. They looked upon its glittering surface, but no one dared to steal it. The cup was a symbol of Vlad's new world. It was a testament to a society so paralyzed by fear that the very thought of a crime became impossible. The honesty of the people was not born of virtue. It was born of a constant, vivid, and terrifying awareness of the impaling stake that awaited them if they failed the test. Vlad's obsession with order extended to all corners of life. He held a particular contempt for the merchant class, whom he saw as parasites, cheating honest folk with dishonest scales and shoddy goods. Foreign merchants who came to his kingdom were warned that his laws were absolute. One story tells of a merchant from Florence who, knowing of Vlad's reputation, left a chest of gold in the street overnight, certain it would be safe. The next morning, he counted his coins and found that a single ducat was missing. He went to Vlad and complained. Vlad assured him the thief would be found and, as the merchant was leaving, told him to check his chest again the next day. The merchant did so and found that the missing coin had been returned, along with one extra. When he went to Vlad to honestly report the extra coin, Vlad looked at him with a cold smile. "Had you not told me of this extra coin," the prince said, "I would have had you impaled alongside the thief." His war on disorder soon took an even darker, more horrifying turn. He became obsessed with the idea of eradicating poverty itself, not through charity, but through annihilation. He saw the poor, the sick, and the vagrant, not as unfortunate souls to be pitied, but as a stain on the purity of his kingdom, a useless drain on its resources. According to the German chronicles that documented his reign, he summoned all the beggars, cripples, and sick people from across Wallachia to his court in Targovište. He promised them a great feast, a magnificent act of princely charity. Hundreds of people came, their hearts filled with a desperate hope. They were led into a great hall, and for the first time in years, their bellies were filled with food and wine. They ate and drank, praising the voivode for his incredible generosity. As the celebration reached its peak, Vlad himself appeared. He stood before the crowd and asked them a strange question. "Do you want to be without cares, lacking nothing in this world?" When they all cried out, "Yes," he gave a quiet signal. He left the hall, and his soldiers sealed the great wooden doors from the outside, barring them shut. Then they set the building on fire. The hall was transformed into a screaming inferno. Everyone inside was burned alive. Vlad reportedly stood outside, watching the flames consume the building, his face calm. He explained to his horrified boyars that he had done this not out of cruelty, but as an act of mercy. He had cleansed his land of its misery, ensuring that these people would no longer be a burden to themselves or to others. It was an act of social purification so monstrous it bordered on the surreal. This obsession with purity extended to the moral conduct of his people, particularly women. He enforced a rigid, puritanical code, and the punishments for those who transgressed were a unique form of horror. Adulterous women were said to have their skin stripped from their bodies and displayed in the public square, or they were impaled through the vagina with a red-hot poker and left to die. A lazy wife who did not have her husband's shirt ready when he returned from the fields might have her hands cut off. These acts, as described by his enemies, seem like the work of a deranged sadist, a man who took pleasure in the creative application of pain. And perhaps he did. But to understand Vlad Dracula, we must see these horrors through the lens of his own profound trauma. His obsession with absolute order was a direct and violent reaction to the chaos and betrayal that had defined his youth. The world he had known was one of treacherous nobles, weak rulers, and a populace that could not be trusted. His kingdom, in his eyes, was a sick patient, and he was the surgeon, tasked with cutting out the disease. He wasn't just punishing criminals, he was attempting to re-engineer the very soul of his nation. He was trying to create a society as hard, as unbending, and as pure as his own will. The only surgical tool he knew, the only language of authority he truly trusted, was the stake. In his own twisted mind, he was not a tyrant. He was a savior, and the screams of his victims were simply the necessary sounds of a kingdom being cleansed. For several years after the Easter massacre, a strange and terrible peace settled over Wallachia. It was not the peace of contentment, but the peace of a graveyard, a profound and deathly quiet. Vlad Dracula's war on his own people had been a terrifying success. The boyar class was broken, either dead or wholly subservient. The merchant guilds paid their taxes without question. The common folk went about their days in a state of rigid, fearful obedience. Theft was a forgotten crime. Corruption was a death sentence. Wallachia was now a perfect machine, a society cleansed of all disorder, its gears oiled with the blood of any who dared to disrupt its function. And at its center sat the prince, his will the nation's only law, his authority absolute and unquestioned. During this time, Vlad continued his father's delicate and humiliating dance with the Ottoman Empire. He was a Christian prince, a member of the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend the cross. Yet each year, he sent a caravan south across the Danube, bearing the required tribute to the Sultan's court, thousands of golden ducats, and a levy of Wallachia's finest young boys, destined to be raised as janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the empire. It was a bitter poison to swallow, a yearly reminder of his own past as a hostage, and of Wallachia's status as a vassal state. But it was a necessary poison, the price of a fragile peace, that allowed him to consolidate his own power at home. But the man to whom he paid this tribute was no longer the shrewd Sultan Murad, who had been his jailer. The Ottoman throne was now occupied by a figure of world-shaking power and ambition. This was Sultan Mehmed II, the man Vlad had known as a boy in the gilded cage of the Ottoman court. But the boy was gone. In his place was a living legend, a military genius who, in 1453, had achieved the impossible. He had done what no emperor or caliph had managed in 1,000 years. He had conquered the great city of Constantinople. Mehmed, the conqueror, was now the master of the Eastern world, and his gaze was fixed firmly on the West. He was not a man who tolerated half-loyalties or delayed tributes. He saw Wallachia not as a respectable vassal, but as a future province of his ever-expanding empire, and he saw its defiant prince as an obstacle to be removed. The fragile peace was destined to break. By 1459, Vlad had finished his work at home. His kingdom was orderly, his power was absolute, and his treasury was full. The boy who had been forced to learn the ways of his enemy was now a man, ready to use that knowledge. He made a decision. The dance was over. The years of quiet submission were at an end. He would no longer be the Sultan's vassal. He would be his sworn enemy. He would fulfill the vow his father had made to the Order of the Dragon. He would wage a holy war. His first act was one of simple, provocative silence. He stopped paying the tribute. For 2 years, no gold and no boys were sent south across the Danube. At first, the Sultan, preoccupied with other conquests, may have seen it as a minor oversight. But by the winter of 1461, Mehmed's patience had run out. This was not just a financial issue, it was a public challenge to his authority. He dispatched 2 envoys to Vlad's court at Targovishte. Their message was simple: deliver the overdue tribute, including a backlog of 500 boys for the Janissary Corps, and present yourself at Constantinople to renew your oath of loyalty, or face the consequences. The arrival of the Ottoman envoys was a moment of high political theatre. They were not simple messengers. They were projections of the Sultan's immense power, and they carried themselves with the casual arrogance of men who represented an empire that did not make requests, but gave commands. They were led into Vlad's throne room, a place now famous for its grim and orderly silence. Vlad sat upon his throne, not surrounded by fawning courtiers, but by his most loyal and battle-hardened mercenaries, their faces as cold and as hard as their masters. The air in the hall was thick with unspoken hostility. The chief envoy began to speak, his voice ringing with an authority he believed to be unchallengeable. He delivered the Sultan's demands. Vlad listened, his face an impassive mask, his eyes never leaving the envoy's face. When the man was finished, Vlad did not speak of gold or of boys. He asked a simple question. "Why do you keep your hats upon your heads in my presence?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. He was referring to their turbans. "Do you not know the custom of showing respect in a prince's court?" The envoys were taken aback, insulted by this focus on a minor point of protocol. The chief envoy, his back stiff with indignation, replied, "It is the custom of our people, and it is the way of our imperial court. We do not uncover our heads, even in the presence of the Sultan himself." Vlad stared at them for a long, silent moment. The hall was so quiet one could hear the flicker of the torches on the walls. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a predator that has just seen its prey walk willingly into a trap. "Then I," he said, his voice a low and menacing purr, "wish to strengthen this custom for you so that you may never break it, even by accident." He gave a quiet signal. Before the envoys could react, his guards seized them. The men, who had been so arrogant just moments before, now struggled, their faces masks of disbelief and dawning terror. They were held fast, forced to their knees before the throne. Vlad called for a blacksmith with a hammer and a handful of long iron nails. The envoys began to scream, begging for the mercy that was a foreign concept in this court. Vlad watched, his expression unchanged, as his order was carried out. One by one, the envoys' turbans were nailed directly to their skulls. The horrifying sound of the hammer striking the nails, a dull and sickening thud, echoed through the stone hall, a sound punctuated by the agonizing shrieks of the victims. It was an act of calculated, symbolic, and unimaginable cruelty. It was not a simple murder. It was a message, written in blood and bone, intended for an audience of one, the Sultan himself. When the work was done, the mutilated and dying men were dragged from the hall. Vlad had their bodies preserved and sent back across the Danube, a gruesome diplomatic package delivered to the court at Constantinople. He was returning the Sultan's messengers, with his answer attached. This single act was an irreversible declaration of war. It was a personal insult of such magnitude that it could only be answered with total annihilation. Vlad Dracula, the prince of a tiny, impoverished kingdom, had just spat in the face of the most powerful man in the world. He had not just poked the dragon, he had driven a nail through its eye. He knew that the full, world-breaking wrath of the Ottoman Empire would now descend upon him, and he was ready. The holy war had begun. In the grand, sun-drenched courts of Constantinople, the arrival of the mutilated envoys was an act of unimaginable sacrilege. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of cities, the master of a dozen kingdoms, the man who saw himself as the heir to the Roman Caesars, was presented with the grotesque remains of his messengers. Their faces were frozen in masks of agony, the turbans they had refused to remove now permanently affixed to their skulls with iron nails. The insult was so profound, so personal, that the Sultan's court was reportedly stunned into a terrified silence. Mehmed's rage was not the hot, quick anger of a lesser man. It was a cold, tectonic fury, the kind of rage that could shatter kingdoms. He declared that this was no longer a matter for his generals. The Prince of Wallachia had not just defied the empire, he had personally insulted the Sultan. Mehmed would lead the punitive expedition himself. He would not just conquer Wallachia, he would erase it from the map. He would grind its insolent prince into dust and salt the earth where his castle once stood. In the spring of 1462, the most powerful military machine in the world began to move. The army Mehmed assembled was a terrifying spectacle of imperial might. It was a force of over 90,000 men, a multi-ethnic professional fighting force that had broken the invincible walls of Constantinople. At its core were the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers taken as boys from Christian lands, forged into the most disciplined and fanatical infantry on earth. They were supported by vast wings of cavalry, siege engineers who could level a city, and a baggage train that stretched for miles, a moving city of men and horses. And at their head rode the conqueror himself, accompanied by Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome, now a loyal Ottoman commander, ready to be placed on the throne once his defiant sibling was dealt with. Against this imperial avalanche, Vlad Dracula stood alone. His own army numbered no more than 30,000 men. It was not a professional force, but a hastily assembled militia of peasants, farmers, and minor nobles, supplemented by a corps of loyal mercenaries. They were ill-equipped, undisciplined, but they had two crucial advantages. They were fighting for their homes, and they were led by a commander who was a genius of unconventional warfare, a man who had learned the art of war from both the Hungarians and the Turks, and who was now prepared to unleash a campaign of such savagery it would defy every known rule of conflict. Vlad knew he could not meet the Ottoman army on an open field. To do so would be suicide. His plan was not to defeat the army, but to demoralize it, to bleed it, to break its spirit and send it fleeing back across the Danube. As the great Ottoman force crossed the river and began its march north into Wallachia, they did not find a defending army waiting for them. They found nothing. The land was eerily, unnaturally silent. Vlad had initiated a brutal, scorched earth campaign. The Wallachian peasants had been ordered to abandon their homes and retreat into the dense forests and fortified mountain passes. What they could not carry, they were ordered to destroy. As the Ottoman army advanced, they marched into a man-made desert. The villages they passed were empty, ghostly shells. The fields of crops that were meant to feed their army were burned to black ash, the air thick with the smell of smoke. The wells and streams they hoped would water their horses were poisoned, choked with the rotting carcasses of dead animals. The mighty army of the Sultan was marching into a barren, hostile wasteland, its long supply lines stretching ever thinner, its soldiers growing hungrier and thirstier with every passing mile. This was only the beginning of Vlad's strategy. The empty land was not truly empty. The forests that pressed in on either side of the road were filled with ghosts. Vlad broke his smaller, more mobile army into dozens of small, fast-moving cavalry units. They became predators, living in the shadows of the woods and the treacherous swamps they knew so well. They did not engage the main body of the Ottoman army. They hunted on its fringes, a constant, nagging and deadly presence. A small Ottoman foraging party, sent out to find what little food remained, would venture into a quiet wood, only to be descended upon by a silent, lightning-fast attack. They would be slaughtered to a man before they could even draw their swords, their bodies left for their comrades to find. A grim warning. The Ottoman outriders, the scouts sent ahead of the main column, would simply vanish, their horses returning to camp riderless. At night, the Ottoman soldiers would huddle around their campfires, listening to the sounds of the forest, jumping at every shadow, knowing that Vlad's men were out there, watching, waiting. The Wallachian land itself had become a weapon. The forests were a maze to the invaders, but a sanctuary to the defenders. The very ground under the Ottomans' feet felt treacherous and alive. Then, Vlad unleashed the most terrifying and insidious part of his campaign. He began to wage a form of biological warfare. He went to the poorest, most wretched corners of his kingdom and sought out those afflicted with the most dreaded diseases of the age: bubonic plague, typhus, leprosy. These unfortunate souls, their bodies already racked with sickness, were given a final, terrible command in the service of their prince. They were dressed in Turkish clothes, taught a few phrases of the language, and sent stumbling into the Ottoman camps, pretending to be escaped prisoners or deserters. The Ottoman soldiers, taking pity on them, would bring them in, give them food, and allow them to huddle by their fires for warmth. and these walking weapons would spread their sickness through the tightly packed camp. Soon, the Ottoman soldiers began to die not from the sword, but from a terrifying, unseen enemy within their own ranks. Fevers swept through the tents. Men would wake with the black, swollen buboes of the plague, their bodies racked with a death more agonizing than any battlefield wound. Panic began to fester alongside the disease. The camp was no longer a place of safety. It was a contaminated death trap. The soldiers began to look at each other with suspicion, wondering who might be the next to fall. The mighty army was being eaten away from the inside, its morale crumbling under the weight of hunger, exhaustion, sickness, and a constant, paralyzing fear. The Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, was not a man easily rattled. He was a veteran of 100 battles, a leader of immense personal courage. But even he began to feel the psychological strain. He was marching deeper and deeper into an empty land, his army being slowly bled dry by an enemy he could not see, an enemy who fought like a demon, using methods that were not just unchivalrous, but unholy. Despite the heavy losses, the Ottoman machine continued to grind forward. Its destination, the Wallachian capital, Targovishte. Mehmed believed that if he could just reach the city, he could force Vlad into a final, decisive battle, where the sheer numbers and superiority of the Ottoman army would inevitably triumph. He pushed his weary, demoralized army onward, believing the end of the campaign was in sight. Vlad, watching from his hidden strongholds in the mountains, knew this as well. He had bled the giant, he had sickened it, he had confused it, but he had not stopped it. The Ottoman army, though wounded, was still a vastly superior force. As they closed in on his capital, he knew the time for hiding in the shadows was over. He had one last, desperate gamble to play. It was to be his most audacious, most personal, and most terrifying move yet. He would not wait for the Sultan to arrive at his gates. He would go to the Sultan himself. The great Ottoman army, a wounded but still immense beast, finally lumbered its way to the plains before Targovishte. Sultan Mehmed, the Conqueror, looked upon the modest walls of the Wallachian capital with a grim satisfaction. The long, agonizing march was over. The phantom enemy who had haunted him in the forests and swamps now had nowhere left to run. He was cornered. Here, on this open ground, the Sultan would finally have the decisive, pitched battle he craved. Here, his superior numbers, his cannons, and his elite janissaries would crush the Wallachian prince and put an end to this embarrassing and costly campaign. He ordered his army to make camp for the night, to rest and prepare for the final assault on the city the following day. Inside the walls of Targovishte, Vlad Dracula was facing the abyss. His campaign of attrition had been a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare, but it had not been enough. The Ottoman army, though battered, hungry, and demoralized, was still here, a force that outnumbered his own by at least 3-1. A conventional defense of the city was a strategic impossibility. It would be a heroic, but ultimately suicidal last stand. His boyars and commanders urged him to retreat into the mountains, to save himself, and live to fight another day. But for Vlad, retreat was just a slower form of defeat. His mind, forged in the crucible of his Ottoman captivity, saw a different path. He had learned from his captors that the empire was not just an army, it was a pyramid of power, and at its very peak sat a single man, the Sultan. If that man were to fall, the entire structure could crumble into chaos. He would not fight the Sultan's army. He would fight the Sultan himself. He devised a plan of such breathtaking audacity, a gamble so reckless that it bordered on madness. He would not wait for the Ottoman army to attack his city. He would attack their camp, and his target was not a flank of cavalry or a supply train. His target was the heart of the beast itself, the Sultan's tent. This was to be a decapitation strike, a single, all-or-nothing roll of the dice. And Vlad, a man obsessed with control and detail, would not entrust this mission to a subordinate. He would lead it himself. In the twilight hours, as the Ottoman army settled into its camp, Vlad put his own unique skills to use. He was fluent in Turkish, a language he had been forced to learn as a boy. He disguised himself as a Turkish soldier, and, under the cover of the gathering darkness, he slipped through the enemy lines. He walked through the sprawling Ottoman camp, a ghost in plain sight. He moved with a cold, unnerving confidence, his mind a razor-sharp instrument, memorizing the layout of the tents, the placement of the guards, the patrol routes, and the sounds of the camp as it prepared for sleep. Most importantly, he located his target. The Sultan's tent was impossible to miss, a magnificent pavilion of green silk, a symbol of imperial power, surrounded by the elite guards of the Janissary Corps. Vlad studied its position, the approaches, the weaknesses in its defense. He absorbed every detail, then slipped back through the lines, his mind now holding a perfect map for the chaos he was about to unleash. He returned to his own men and prepared them for the assault. He hand-picked several thousand of his best and bravest cavalry, men who were as loyal to him as wolves to the alpha of the pack. He gave them simple, brutal orders. They would storm the camp at midnight. There was to be no looting, no taking of prisoners. Their one and only objective was the Sultan's green tent. They were to cut their way through the camp, kill Mehmed, and then melt back into the darkness. To sow maximum confusion, they were to carry Turkish torches and shout Turkish battle cries. They would turn the enemy's own identity into a weapon against them. Just after midnight, the attack began. It was not a charge, it was an explosion. The Wallachian cavalry, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle their approach, burst from the forest and slammed into the sleeping Ottoman camp with the force of a tidal wave. The night erupted into a symphony of pure, terrifying chaos. The Wallachians, screaming Turkish commands, cut down the sleepy sentries and galloped through the avenues between the tents, their swords and axes rising and falling in the flickering torchlight. The Ottoman soldiers, startled from their sleep, stumbled out of their tents, confused and half-dressed. They heard Turkish voices shouting. They saw men in Turkish armor cutting down their comrades. And in the pandemonium, they did exactly what Vlad had intended. They began to attack each other. The camp devolved into a swirling, bloody vortex of friendly fire, a self-consuming panic where every shadow was an enemy and every ally was a potential assassin. Bugles were sounded, but they only added to the noise and confusion. The Janissaries, the most disciplined soldiers in the world, formed up to defend the Sultan, but they did not know which way to face, who to fight. At the head of the charge, a phantom of vengeance, was Vlad himself. He and his personal guard did not stop to fight in the chaos. They were a spear aimed at a single point. They galloped through the screaming, dying men, their eyes fixed on the distant green pavilion of the Sultan. They carved a bloody path through the heart of the camp, getting closer and closer to their goal. They smashed through the outer ring of guards, and then a second. The Sultan's own tent was now in sight. They spurred their horses for a final desperate charge. But in the darkness and the chaos, they had made a single, fatal error of navigation. They had mistaken the magnificent tent of two of the Sultan's highest-ranking viziers for the Sultan's own. They descended upon it with a terrible fury, slaughtering everyone inside, believing that in the bloody darkness, they had killed the conqueror himself. Mehmed, meanwhile, had never been in any real danger. He remained in his own tent, protected by a wall of his most loyal janissaries, listening to the sounds of his own army tearing itself apart. Having struck what they believed was the fatal blow, Vlad and his men began their retreat. They fought their way back out of the dying camp, melting back into the familiar darkness of the forest just as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable carnage. The night attack lasted for 3 hours. By the time the sun rose, its weak light revealed a horrifying tableau. The Ottoman camp was a wreck, littered with the bodies of thousands of their own soldiers, many killed by their own comrades. The attack had failed in its primary objective. The Sultan was still alive, but it had succeeded in every other way. It had shattered the morale of the Ottoman army. It had proven that no place was safe, that not even the Sultan's own tent was beyond the Impaler's reach. The myth of Ottoman invincibility had been broken. The soldiers, already weary from the long march, were now deeply, profoundly terrified. They had been fighting a ghost in the woods, but now they knew the ghost could walk through walls. Sultan Mehmed was enraged, but he was also, for the first time, deeply unsettled. His enemy was not a normal commander. He was a creature of the night, a master of terror. But the Sultan was still the conqueror. His rage and his pride demanded that he finish the job. He gave the order to break camp. He would march his shaken, terrified army the final few miles to Targovishte, and he would burn the city to the ground. Vlad Dracula's most audacious military gamble had failed to kill him, and now he would unleash his full and terrible wrath. He believed the worst was over. He had no idea what was waiting for him just down the road. The sun rose on a scene of carnage. The Ottoman camp, a place of disciplined order just the night before, was now a chaotic wreck, littered with the bodies of their own soldiers. But Sultan Mehmed was not a man to be deterred by a single night of terror. His rage, now mixed with a new and unsettling respect for his enemy's audacity, hardened his resolve. The night attack had been a desperate gamble, and it had failed. The Sultan was alive, his army, though shaken, was still intact, and the city of Targovishte was now only a few miles away. He gave the order. The army would march. They would take the city, find the Impaler, and crucify him on the highest tower of his own castle. A grim, determined silence fell over the vast Ottoman column as they began their final advance. The soldiers, their nerves shattered by the nocturnal chaos, marched with their hands tight on the hilts of their swords, their eyes scanning the dark tree line, expecting an ambush at every turn. But the attacks did not come. The land was once again unnervingly still. After an hour, they emerged from the last of the dense forests and saw it, the open plain that led to the capital. A collective sigh of relief went through the ranks. They were out of the suffocating woods, out of the treacherous swamps. The guerrilla war was over. The final, conventional battle was about to begin. A battle they knew they would win. The men began to march with a renewed sense of purpose, the great city of Targovishte now visible in the distance. And then they smelled it. It began as a faint, foul taint on the morning breeze, a scent of rot and decay that was horribly familiar to any veteran of the battlefield. But this was different. It grew stronger with every step they took, a thick, sweet, and overpowering stench of putrefaction that seemed to cling to the back of the throat. It was a smell so potent, so overwhelming, that war-hardened soldiers began to retch, their hands covering their mouths and noses. The horses grew skittish, their eyes wide with animal terror. The army slowed, a wave of confusion and profound unease rippling through the ranks. What army had they defeated that could produce a smell of death on this industrial scale? The Ottoman scouts, the Akunja, rode ahead into a shallow valley that lay directly on the path to the city. They stopped, their horses refusing to go any further. They stared at the sight before them, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. One of them turned his horse and galloped back to the main column, his face as white as bone, his words a choked, terrified babble. The Sultan, annoyed by the delay, rode forward with his Janissary guard to see for himself. He crested a small hill, and there, laid out before him, was the source of the smell. And the world stopped. It was a forest, but it was not a forest of trees. For a distance of 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, the valley was filled with a forest of tall, sharpened stakes. And on every single stake was a body, men, women, and even children. They were arranged in neat, geometric rows, a grotesque parody of an army on parade. The highest-ranking prisoners, the captured Turkish pashas and officers, were impaled on the tallest stakes, a place of honor in this hellscape. Their rotting bodies a testament to their former status. Below them were thousands upon thousands of common soldiers and Bulgarian peasants who had collaborated with the Ottoman army, each one pierced through with a wooden stake. Their bodies in various states of decay, left to be picked apart by the crows and ravens that circled lazily in the sky above. This was not the chaotic aftermath of a battle. This was a work of art, a meticulously constructed outdoor museum of death. There were, by the Chronicle's own accounts, over 20,000 bodies, 20,000 souls, each given their own monument of agony. The Ottoman army, which had seen every horror that 15th century warfare could produce, came to a dead halt. A profound, terrified silence fell over the tens of thousands of soldiers. They were not looking at the work of a man. They were looking at the work of a demon, a vision torn from the deepest, most terrifying pits of hell. The sheer, obsessive order of it all was what broke them. This was not the work of hot-blooded rage. It was the product of a cold, patient, and utterly inhuman mind. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had stared into the mouths of cannons at the walls of Constantinople, the man who had waded through rivers of blood to build his empire, reined in his horse. He stared at the scene, his face, for the first time in his public life, a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He saw the bodies of soldiers he knew, of commanders he respected, now reduced to meat on a stick. He saw the sheer, mathematical precision of the cruelty. He saw the mind that had conceived it. He understood the message Vlad was sending. It was a statement of a will so absolute, a capacity for cruelty so boundless, that it could not be defeated by conventional means. How do you terrorize a man who uses terror as his primary weapon? How do you conquer a kingdom when its ruler is willing to turn it into a literal hell on earth to defend it? According to the Byzantine historian who chronicled the campaign, the Sultan was psychologically broken by the sight. He looked upon the forest of the impaled for a long time, and then he turned to his commanders, his voice filled with a quiet, horrified awe. "How can I win the land of a man who does such things?" he said. "He is a man who has a strange understanding of how to rule." He gave the order. The army would turn back. It was not a military defeat. It was a psychological annihilation. Vlad Dracula had not defeated the Ottoman army with swords or with strategy. He had defeated them with a single, perfect, and unforgettable image. He had held up a mirror to the violence of the world, and he had shown them a reflection so monstrous that even the most battle-hardened conqueror in the world could not stomach it. He had lost the battle for Targovishte, which the Turks would briefly occupy and burn, but he had won the war for the soul of his enemy. This was his masterpiece, the act that would forever earn him his name. He was no longer just the son of the dragon. He was Vlad the Impaler. The Forest of the Impaled was a masterpiece of horror, a psychological victory so profound It had turned back the most powerful army on earth. But victory and survival are not the same thing. As the last of Sultan Mehmed's shaken army retreated back across the Danube, a grim reality began to settle over Wallachia. The kingdom was saved, but it was also shattered. Vlad Dracula's brilliant and brutal campaign had come at a terrible cost. The scorched earth tactics that had starved the Ottoman army had also devastated his own land. His fields were ash, his villages were empty, and his treasury was drained. He had won the battle, but his kingdom was bleeding to death. He was a hero, but he was a hero standing on a pile of ruins. His army, a shadow of its former self. His people, exhausted by war. He knew that the Sultan's retreat was not a final defeat. It was a temporary reprieve. Mehmed the Conqueror was not a man to forget a humiliation of this magnitude. He would be back, and when he returned, his vengeance would be absolute. Vlad's only hope for the long-term survival of his kingdom was a grand Christian alliance, a new crusade to push the Ottomans out of Europe for good. And for that, he needed the help of his powerful backer, his sworn ally in the Order of the Dragon, the King of Hungary. The man who sat on the Hungarian throne was Matthias Corvinus, one of the great figures of the Renaissance. He was a brilliant and cultured king, a patron of the arts and sciences, a man who was building a magnificent, enlightened court in the city of Buda. He was also a shrewd, cunning, and deeply pragmatic political operator. He had received a vast sum of money from the Pope in Rome, funds specifically allocated to launch a great crusade against the Turks, a crusade he was meant to lead alongside his ferocious Wallachian vassal. But Corvinus had not used the money for its intended purpose. The papal gold had been diverted to his own projects, to fund his wars against his Christian rivals in Bohemia, and to strengthen his own political power at home. He had no real intention of launching a full-scale, risky war against the might of the Ottoman Empire. Vlad's savage, one-man crusade, while momentarily useful, was now becoming a serious problem. It was a destabilizing force. It had provoked the Sultan, and now Mehmed was offering Hungary a stable and advantageous peace treaty, on one simple condition: that the Impaler problem be dealt with. The political calculus for Matthias Corvinus was cold and simple. On one side, he had a dangerous, unpredictable, and financially exhausted ally in Vlad, a man whose brutal methods were becoming an embarrassment. On the other, he had the promise of peace with the world's greatest superpower and a convenient excuse for where the Pope's crusade money had gone. The choice was clear. The hero of Christendom had become more valuable as a political prisoner than as an ally. Unaware of this cold betrayal, Vlad Dracula rode north towards the Hungarian border in the winter of 1462. He was traveling to meet King Matthias, expecting to be hailed as the savior of the frontier, the man who had single-handedly stared down the conqueror of Constantinople. He was expecting to be given fresh troops, supplies, and the papal gold he desperately needed to rebuild his kingdom and prepare for the next Ottoman invasion. He was riding towards his ally, his shield, the only man in the world who could guarantee his survival. He was riding directly into a trap. He was met not with a hero's welcome, but with a squadron of Hungarian soldiers. He was not escorted to the king's court, but arrested. The official justification was a masterpiece of political fiction. He was presented with a series of forged letters, supposedly written by Vlad himself. These letters, intercepted by the king's men, proved that Vlad Dracula had been a traitor all along. They claimed that his entire war against the Turks was a sham, and that he had secretly been plotting with Sultan Mehmed to attack the Kingdom of Hungary itself. The irony was so profound, it was almost surreal. The man who had just created a monument of 20,000 dead Turkish bodies, the man whose hatred for the Ottomans was the single defining feature of his entire life, was now being arrested on the charge of being a secret Ottoman agent. It was a lie so audacious, so transparently false, that it could only be enforced by the absolute power of a king. For Vlad, this betrayal was perhaps even more psychologically devastating than the one he had suffered as a child. He had been betrayed by his father out of a desperate necessity. He had been betrayed by the boyars out of greed and ambition. He understood those motivations. But this was a betrayal by his own side, by his Christian allies, by the very people he had been fighting and dying to protect. It was a betrayal born not of passion, but of cold, cynical, and pragmatic politics. It was the ultimate confirmation of the world view that had been forged in him since childhood. The world was fundamentally treacherous. Alliances were illusions, and there was no one, absolutely no one, you could trust. The hero who had saved Wallachia was now its greatest traitor. The man who had defied a sultan was now the prisoner of a king. The Impaler prince, the most feared warlord in all of Christendom, was put in chains. For the next 12 years, he vanished from the world. He was held as a political prisoner in Hungary, moved between the royal palaces of Buda and Visegrad. He was not kept in a squalid dungeon. His imprisonment was a comfortable one, suitable for a man of his noble birth. But it was an imprisonment nonetheless. He was a dragon in a cage, a creature of immense violence and ferocious will, now reduced to a political pawn, a piece on Matthias Corvinus's chessboard, to be held, and perhaps one day used again. The most dangerous man in Europe had been neutralized, not by an army, but by a lie. His holy war was over, his kingdom was lost once again, and he could do nothing but sit and wait as the world outside began to transform him from a man into a monster. For 12 years, the dragon was in chains. Vlad Dracula, the most ferocious and feared warrior on the Christian frontier, was a guest in a Hungarian prison, a caged lion whose roars no longer reached the outside world. He was neutralized, removed from the great game of war and politics. But in his absence, something strange and powerful began to happen. The story of the man began to escape the confines of history and bleed into the realm of legend. While Vlad the man was silenced, his name was becoming more infamous and more terrifying than ever before. This transformation was made possible by a revolutionary new technology that was just beginning to spread across Europe: the Gutenberg printing press. Before this time, stories traveled at the speed of a human voice, as gossip, as rumor, as a traveler's tale told in a smoky tavern. They were fluid, changeable things. But the printing press could take a story, a single version of a story, and replicate it 1,000 times over on cheap paper. It could spread an idea across a continent with a speed and permanence that was previously unimaginable. And in the 15th century, the printers of the Holy Roman Empire discovered a truth that has remained unchanged to this day. Nothing sells like a story of sensational, gruesome, and horrifying violence. They were hungry for monsters, and in the caged Prince of Wallachia, they found the greatest monster of their age. The primary authors of this new dark legend were the Saxon merchants of southern Transylvania and northern Wallachia. These were communities of ethnic Germans who had been granted special trading privileges for centuries. Vlad, in his quest for absolute control, and his desire to protect his own Wallachian merchants had brutally curtailed their economic power. He had raided their towns, seized their goods, and, in his trademark fashion, had impaled hundreds of them in the public squares of their own cities as a warning against defying his authority. These merchants hated him with a passion born of both economic ruin and profound terror. And now, with Vlad safely imprisoned by their Hungarian protectors, they saw an opportunity for revenge. They could not fight him with swords, so they would fight him with words. They began to compile every story, every rumor, every half-truth, and every nightmare about the Impaler prince, and they took these stories to the German printers. King Matthias Corvinus, Vlad's jailer, almost certainly encouraged this campaign. The stories served as the perfect propaganda to justify his own treacherous actions. By painting Vlad not as a betrayed Christian hero, but as a demonic, blood-crazed psychopath, Corvinus could portray himself as the man who had heroically caged a monster, thus excusing his own failure to mount the crusade the Pope had paid him for. And so, the printing presses of Germany began to churn out dozens of pamphlets, cheap, mass-produced booklets with lurid, sensational titles like The Terrifying and Horrifying Story of the Savage Blood Drinker, Voivode Dracula. These pamphlets were the true crime podcasts of their day, and they became international bestsellers. But their most powerful and enduring feature was not the text, but the illustrations. Accompanying the gruesome tales were stark, terrifying woodcut images that burned themselves into the European imagination. These were the first viral images of a serial killer, and they created the visual brand of his cruelty. One of the most famous woodcuts depicts a stern, mustachioed Vlad, sitting at a finely set table, dining peacefully. But his table is set in the middle of a field of horror, a forest of the impaled, where dozens of his victims are writhing in agony on stakes, while an executioner calmly hacks apart another body in the foreground. The image is a masterpiece of psychological horror, depicting a man completely at ease, even bored, in the midst of a hell of his own making. Another woodcut shows him meeting with a group of monks, while in the background, bodies are being boiled in a great cauldron. Others showed him personally chopping up his victims, their limbs scattered around him like firewood. These images were powerful, visceral, and they became the enduring iconography of his evil. The stories they accompanied were a cocktail of fact and horrifying fiction. They recounted his real, politically motivated cruelties, like the massacre of the boyars, but they embellished them and added new tales of a purely sadistic, almost supernatural cruelty. They told stories of how he would invite guests to his castle for a feast, only to have them roasted on spits over a fire. They whispered of how he would force mothers to eat their own roasted children. One of the most famous and influential tales was that he would often have the blood of his victims collected in bowls, and that he would dip his bread into it as he ate his meals. This is perhaps the first faint historical echo of the vampire myth to come. Not a creature who drinks blood to live, but a man so monstrous he uses it as a condiment. These pamphlets transformed Vlad from a regional tyrant into a figure of pure, almost folkloric evil. In these stories, his motivations were stripped away. He was no longer a traumatized prince seeking order or a desperate warlord fighting for his kingdom. He was a monster who killed for the sheer, depraved pleasure of it. He was a Wütrich, a German word that means more than just a tyrant. It means a sadist, a monster, a creature that delights in the suffering of others. And so, as Vlad sat in his Hungarian prison, his reputation was being murdered in the public square of European opinion. He was becoming a continental boogeyman, a cautionary tale told to frightened children in the cities of Germany, a household name synonymous with unimaginable cruelty. The historical Vlad Dracula, the complex and brutal man, was beginning to die, and in his place a new creature was being born, a monster of folklore, a black legend set in cheap ink and terrifying pictures, a myth ready to outlive the man himself by centuries. The foundation for the vampire of the night was being laid, not in the misty mountains of Transylvania, but on the noisy, clattering printing presses of Germany. For 12 years, the dragon was in chains, and his black legend ran wild across Europe. He was a monster in a storybook, a convenient villain for his enemies. But in the ever-turning game of Balkan politics, a useful monster is a weapon that is never left to rust for too long. The political winds began to shift once more. The peace between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire had fallen apart, and King Matthias Corvinus once again found himself in need of a fierce, anti-Ottoman warlord on the Wallachian throne. His current puppet was proving ineffective, and he knew the man he held in his prison was the most effective weapon against the Turks that Christendom had ever produced. And so, after more than a decade of captivity, Vlad Dracula was brought out of the shadows. But freedom came at a price. He was forced to abandon the Orthodox faith of his homeland and formally convert to Catholicism, a public act of submission to the Hungarian king and the Pope in Rome. He was also married to a member of the Hungarian royal family, Ilona Szilágyi, a political union designed to bind him permanently to the Hungarian crown. He was no longer a sovereign prince. He was an instrument of Hungarian policy, a tamed dragon whose chain was now held firmly by the king who had once betrayed him. He was a changed man. Now in his mid-40s, the years of imprisonment had tempered the fiery rage of his youth into a harder, more cynical resolve. The world had shown him its treacherous nature time and time again, and he no longer fought for holy causes or grand alliances. He fought for one thing and one thing only: his own survival and the reclamation of the throne that had been stolen from him. In 1476, the opportunity finally came. Backed by Hungarian and Moldavian forces, Vlad Dracula marched on Wallachia for a third and final time. His reputation, fueled by the German pamphlets, preceded him. He was no longer just the son of the dragon. He was the Impaler, the blood drinker, a figure of almost supernatural terror. The pro-Ottoman ruler of Wallachia fled at the mere news of his approach, and in November of 1476, Vlad entered Targovishte and sat upon his throne once more. His third reign had begun, but the kingdom he now ruled was a viper's nest. The boyars who swore fealty to him did so with fear in their eyes, their loyalty as thin as ice. The peasants, who had suffered under decades of war, were weary, and the Ottoman army was already gathering across the Danube to crush him once and for all. His reign, he knew, would be a constant battle. The end came just 2 months later. It was not a glorious, epic confrontation like the defense of Targovishte. It was a messy, confusing, and ignoble death on a frozen battlefield. A large Turkish raiding party was sweeping through the country, and Vlad, with a small contingent of his men, rode out to meet them in a skirmish near Bucharest. The details of his final battle are lost to the fog of war, muddled by conflicting chronicles. What is known is that in the chaos of the fight, Vlad was cut down and killed. Some sources say he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of Turks. Others whisper a darker tale, that in the heat of the battle, he was either accidentally killed by his own men, who mistook his ferocious charge for a Turkish attack, or that he was deliberately assassinated by treacherous Wallachian boyars, who feared the return of his reign of terror more than they feared the Sultan. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The dragon was finally slain. His death was not enough for his enemies. The Sultan, his old childhood rival Mehmed, required proof. Vlad's body was decapitated on the battlefield. His head was preserved in a jar of honey and sent to Constantinople as a gruesome trophy. It was put on display, mounted on a high stake in the center of the city for all to see. The final, humiliating end for the Impaler prince. His body was reportedly buried by the monks at a monastery in Snagov, near the site of his final battle. But his true grave has never been found. The man was dead. His brutal, violent, and tragic life was over. He had been a hostage, a prince, a crusader, a tyrant, a hero, and a prisoner. He had saved his country with acts of unimaginable horror, only to be betrayed, caged, and ultimately cut down in a muddy field. But in his death, the black legend that had been born on the printing presses of Germany was now truly set free. The monster of folklore was no longer tethered to the reality of the man. It was free to grow, to mutate, and to wait in the shadows of history for a new master to give it a new and even more terrifying form. The dragon was slain. His head, a gruesome trophy for his childhood rival, rotted on a stake in Constantinople. His body, if the monks of Snagov are to be believed, was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. The historical life of Vlad III Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, was over. He had been a hostage, a prince, a crusader, a tyrant, a hero, and a prisoner. He had saved his country with acts of unimaginable horror, only to be betrayed, caged, and ultimately cut down in a muddy field. The man was dead, but his story had just begun. In his death, the black legend that had been born on the printing presses of Germany was now truly set free. The monster of folklore was no longer tethered to the reality of the man. It was free to grow, to mutate, and to haunt the shadows of the European imagination. For 400 years, his ghost lingered. In Romania, he was remembered by some as a cruel but just ruler, a national hero who defended the land against the Turks. But outside, in the German pamphlets and the Russian tales, his name remained a byword for demonic cruelty, the blood drinker, the child killer, the ogre in the castle. He was a monster, but he was a human monster, his evil a product of our own world. Then, in the gaslit world of late 19th century London, a new master found a new use for this old ghost. His name was Bram Stoker. He was not a historian. He was a theatre manager and an aspiring author of Gothic fiction. He was a man steeped in the romantic horrors of his age, tales of haunted castles, of forbidden passions, and of ancient evils preying on modern society. He was searching for a villain for his new novel, a creature that could embody the fears of his time, the fear of foreign influence, of primal desires lurking beneath the veneer of civilization, and of a past that refused to die. He had a story, but he did not yet have a name for his villain, a blood-drinking count from the wild, eastern edges of Europe. For a time, he called him Count Wampir. It was a clumsy, generic name, lacking the spark of true terror. And so, Stoker went to the library. In the quiet, dusty archives of the British Museum, he began to research the geography and folklore of the Carpathian Mountains, a region that, to the Victorian mind, was a land of dark superstition and ancient mystery. It was there that he stumbled upon a book, a dry historical account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. And in that book, he found a footnote. It referred to a 15th century prince, a voivode who had fought against the Turks, a man whose patronymic was Dracula. The footnote went on to explain, with a tantalizing lack of detail, that in the Wallachian language, this name meant devil. We can only imagine the thrill that shot through Stoker in that moment. Dracula. The name itself was perfect. It was harsh, it was foreign, and it carried with it the faint satanic echo of its meaning. He read on, finding a few brief, brutal passages about this historical Dracula, his reputation for cruelty, his wars, his moniker of the Impaler. Stoker didn't need the full, complex biography. He didn't need to understand the politics of the 15th century or the deep trauma of the boy held hostage. All he needed was the name, the setting, and the reputation for monstrousness. In a stroke of literary genius, Stoker took three distinct elements and fused them together into one immortal creature. First, from the historical Vlad III, he took the name Dracula and the faint, brutal outline of his life, an aristocratic warlord from a remote, mountainous land, known for his incredible cruelty. Second, from the travelogues and maps of his day, he borrowed the dramatic, mist-shrouded landscapes of Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains, creating the perfect Gothic stage for his drama. And third, from the deep, rich well of Eastern European folklore, he took the local vampire myth, the story of the Strigoi, or Nosferatu, the restless, undead spirit that rose from its grave at night to drink the blood of the living and steal the life from the young. The historical man and the folkloric monster were wedded together on the page. The fearsome warlord of Wallachia was reborn as the undead Count of Transylvania. The man who had impaled thousands to defend his kingdom was transformed into a creature who bit necks to sustain his own unnatural life. The Impaler prince had died, but Count Dracula was born, and this is the final, profound irony of Vlad's story. The black legend that his German enemies had created to destroy his reputation became the very thing that granted him a strange and terrible kind of immortality. He is now remembered not for his real, historically significant deeds, his desperate holy war, his defense of his kingdom, his brutal but effective use of psychological terror. He is remembered for the fictional crimes of a supernatural creature that an Irish novelist invented 400 years after his death. In the end, the true horror of Vlad the Impaler was not that he was a creature of the night who drank blood to survive. The true horror was that he was a product of our own world. He was a man of immense intelligence and ferocious will, a leader forged in the crucible of trauma, who used unimaginable cruelty as a deliberate instrument of statecraft. His atrocities were so profound, so methodical, so far beyond the normal spectrum of human evil, that history itself seemed to need to invent a supernatural explanation to make sense of him. The vampire is the comfortable myth, the monster that can be defeated with a crucifix and a wooden stake. But the man is the real warning, a warning that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones who lurk in the shadows of folklore, but the ones who step out into the light of history, often hailed as heroes, protectors and saviors, their thrones built on a foundation of perfect, terrifying order, their peace bought with a forest of the dead. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of history, and for helping us keep these complex stories alive. If you believe these forgotten histories deserve to be remembered, please consider liking this video and subscribing to While History Sleeps. We are always interested to hear your thoughts, so let us know in the comments. Was Vlad Dracula a monster or a tragic hero forged by a brutal world? Until next time, stay curious.